An honor, a privilege to be introducing and to be welcoming to our conference Professor Barry Schwartz. He is a professor of psychology at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. He's been there since receiving his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1971. He has written 10 books and more than 100 articles for professional journals. In 2004, Professor Schwartz published The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less. It was named one of the top business books of the year by both Business Week and Forbes magazine, and has been translated into 25 languages. Professor Schwartz has published articles in sources as diverse as the New York Times Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Parade Magazine, USA Today, Advertising Age, Slate, Scientific American, The New Republic, Newsday, Harvard Business Review, Guardian, and so on and so on. He has appeared on dozens of radio shows, including NPR's Morning Edition and Talk of the Nation, and has been interviewed on Anderson Cooper 360 on CNN, as well as the Lehrer NewsHour and CBS Sunday Morning. He has lectured to British and Dutch governments, as well as trade organizations and businesses representing industries as diverse as healthcare, personal finance, travel and leisure, restaurants, supermarkets, consumer electronics, office supplies, software development, e-commerce, advertising, and so on. Professor Schwartz's new book, written with his colleague Ken Sharp, is Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing. Some of you I know told me how excited you were that he's here because you've seen him speak about practical wisdom through the TED Talks. It is a rare honor indeed. Thank you for coming. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Is the mic okay? I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction. In fact, I'm pretty sure I can't live up to that introduction, but I'm going to try. As much as it's exciting to talk to consumer electronics and supermarket groups, it's much more exciting to talk to a group like you and to share some of the ideas that I've developed with Ken Sharp on the topic of practical wisdom. Since this is, you may not think of yourselves as a small group, but since it's a relatively small group, and I have a lot of time allotted to me, I'm quite happy to take your questions and comments as I go. And if you're too reticent to do that, there ought to be plenty of time for questions and comments when I finish. So, let's begin. Here's the book, so you can't miss it the next time you're in an airport. It will be prominently displayed. The talk is going to be a little bit America-centric. I think that a lot of what I have to say that's negative, the United States does worse than many other comparable countries, notably Canada. But I still suspect that some of the problems I'm going to talk about you can probably identify in your own experience. At least I hope so, otherwise you've wasted your time bringing me here. In the United States, it is not an exaggeration to say that everything is broken. The schools are failing our children. Healthcare clinics are failing sick people. Drug companies, not alone, but to a large degree, are corrupting our science. The financial system is in tatters, and we almost managed to bring down the entire world financial system. Our political system is completely dysfunctional, and I don't think yours can rival ours in that regard. And our Supreme Court has become almost completely political. Wherever we turn in the United States, institutions are failing to give us what we need and what we want. Now, we can stop here, because I'm sure that what I just said to you is an incredible insight. It hasn't occurred to any of you. So is that, can we now go play tennis or something? No. Everybody knows that what I just said is true. People differ from one another in the extent, in their assessment of the magnitude of the problem, but everyone acknowledges that there are massive problems in the United States and in most other developed countries with almost all of our critical social institutions. So, given that everyone knows the problem, the question is, how do you go about fixing the problem? And everyone seems to agree that there are two tools we can rely on to fix broken institutions. One tool is to come up with more and better rules, more regulations and smarter regulations. The second tool is to come up with more and smarter incentives. If you make it worth people's while to do the right thing, they'll do the right thing. If people can do well by doing good, they'll do good. More rules, more incentives. Sticks in the form of rules, carrots in the form of incentives. When the financial system collapsed, there was lots and lots of hand-wringing and lots of op-ed writing about how to fix it, and without exception, they all involved coming up with better rules to control the bankers and smarter incentives to control the investors. What else is there? And the thrust of our book and the thrust of my talk today is to suggest that rules, and this is a colossal mistake, that rules and incentives will never get us what we need and what we want. We need something else. We need something either instead or at least in addition to rules and incentives, and that something else is character. That something else is what Aristotle called virtue. And we need a particular virtue, the one that Aristotle called practical wisdom. And so what I'm going to try to do this morning is this. I'm going to try first to convince you of how important practical wisdom is in professional life. And only after I've convinced you of how important it is, I'll spend a little bit of time talking to you about what it is. I'm a big fan of not defining things until we already know what they are. So then I'm going to talk about how our efforts to make institutions better are in fact making them worse by, in effect, making war on wisdom. The reliance on rules and incentives destroys wisdom rather than replacing it, and it certainly doesn't nourish it. Then I'll make a few suggestions about how we can respond to the threat to wisdom that our current practices are posing, and then there'll be a brief discussion of the relevance of this general argument to matters of medical ethics, ethics in psychotherapy, and even research ethics. As you'll see at the end of my talk, I had the great misfortune to be the chair of my institution's institutional review board a few years ago, and I found it a completely eye-opening experience just how much the good intentions of protecting people from callous researchers have gone astray over the years. Okay, so that's the plan. So let's begin with why we need wisdom. And I think the best way to illustrate why we need it, which is largely going to be telling you what you already know, is through a few examples. So I'm going to describe to you, and to some degree read to you, because I've taken these things from written texts, some examples of wisdom in action. The first comes from an experience that Jerome Groopman, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, he's an oncologist and researcher at Harvard Medical School, but he also writes books and he writes articles frequently for the New Yorker, and he's a very eloquent and moving writer. Anyway, he wrote an article in the New Yorker some years ago called "You're Going to Die." And what the article was about was how doctors give patients bad news. So he describes the case of Maxine, a 30-year-old woman who discovered a pea-sized lump in her breast. Tests have revealed that the lump is malignant and that the cancer has already spread to her spine and her liver. Now she's sitting across the desk from Groopman, accompanied by her parents and her fiancé, and Groopman has to tell her that in all likelihood she will be dead within 2 years. And his question is, how should this conversation proceed. On the one hand, the canons of medical ethics, not to mention more general moral principles that demand that we treat people with respect, tell Groupman that he has to tell Maxine the truth. On the other hand, there are lots of different ways to tell the truth. There are lots of different truths. And so Groupman's approach, he realizes, may determine whether Maxine's last months of life are full of hopelessness and misery, or whether she will have the strength to go through rigorous, debilitating treatment with some measure of optimism. So how does this conversation go? He begins by reviewing the facts, the size and location of the tumor, evidence of its spread. But before complete hopelessness sets in, he quickly says that the cancer should be treated aggressively. You stand a strong chance of remission, he says. Now, his patient's mother responds with, quote, so that means she'll be okay. And Groupman immediately realizes that he has to backtrack a little. He has to make it clear that remission is not cure. Treatment may take some of the current metastatic posits away, but they will not almost certainly come back. In other places, treatment is palliative. But what does palliative mean? So Groupman goes on. He says, we can knock out the cancer with drugs. Your bones and liver can heal. You can go back to living a normal life. And when, and just to show you how subtle this is, should he say when or should he say if? And when the cancer returns. Is it when the cancer returns or is it if the cancer returns? A lot hangs on his choice of word there. When the cancer returns, we'll work to knock it down. Should he say knock it down or should he say knock it out? A lot hangs on his choice of words there. Meanwhile, new treatments may emerge from research that are far more effective than our current ones. So at the very least, we're buying time. Now what? He's presented a best case, and everyone's about to cry. But he has to present a worst case also. He has to let Maxine know that a point may, or should he say will, be reached at which treatments are no longer effective. He has to say this both because he owes it to Maxine and because she will likely face decisions about when to stop therapy that she should be thinking about while she is still well enough to do the thinking coherently. So Groupman presents the worst case also. Maxine seems satisfied. She doesn't seem to want to know anymore. And Groupman concludes by saying, we need to plan for the best while acknowledging the worst. All the while that he is having this painful conversation, he realizes that it isn't just what he says that matters, but how he says it. If he hesitates too long before answering a bleak question, no matter how encouraging he is, they'll think he's holding something back. If he's too upbeat in describing the most positive scenario, they'll leave the office with unrealistic hopes. For Jerome Groupman to pull this off, both the form and the content of what he says have to be exactly right. And the question is, how do doctors learn to have such difficult conversations? And Groupman's answer here is telling, because what he says is this is the one part of medical practice where doctors have absolutely no experience. Not only do they not do it, but they don't even see it being done. When the people who are training them have such conversations with patients, they do it in the study, and the door to the study is closed. And so, when you become a practitioner, you are on your own. And he describes his own ghastly mistakes as he was a beginning doctor, being too honest and crushing people, being too optimistic and creating false hopes. And slowly, over time, he learned how to be nuanced, read the people, read the situation, and find the right way to talk about horrible circumstances, although God knows he wasn't right all the time. So this is an example of wise practice in action. Here's another. This concerns a judge who worked in Philadelphia, quite a distinguished judge, Lois Forer. She presided over the Court of Common Pleas, Criminal Division, and a case came to her, the case of Michael, and it appeared completely routine. He was a typical offender, at least in Philadelphia. He was young, he was male, he was black, he was a high school dropout without a job. The charge was an insignificant holdup that occasioned no comment in the newspapers. And the trial itself, in the busy life of a judge, was an absolutely run-of-the-mill event. The year before, Michael had, brandishing a gun, held up a taxi and taken $50 from the driver and the driver's passenger, harming neither of them. He was immediately apprehended. It was his first offense. Although he had dropped out of school to marry his pregnant girlfriend, Michael later obtained a high school equivalency diploma. He had been steadily employed, earning enough to send his daughter to parochial school, which was a considerable sacrifice for him and his wife. Shortly before the holdup, he had lost his job. Despondent because he couldn't support his family, he went out on a Saturday night, had more than a few drinks, and then he robbed the taxi. So Forer says, there was no doubt that Michael was guilty, but the penalty posed problems. The prosecutor wanted a 5-year sentence. Forer turned to Pennsylvania sentencing guidelines, which are a set of rules and regulations designed to take discretion out of the hands of judges. I guess their intent was not to take discretion out of the hands of judges. Their intent was to make uniform sentences for uniform crimes. And the minimum sentence prescribed by these guidelines was 2 years. The prosecutor wanted 5 years, and it turned out that armed robbery in a public conveyance could get you 5 years, and a taxi cab is a public conveyance. So what did Forer do? Quote, I decided to deviate from the guidelines. I sentenced Michael to 11 and a half months in the county jail, permitting him to leave jail every day and go to work so he could continue to support his family. So he would sleep in jail, he'd get up, go to work, come back to jail, and spend the night in jail. My rationale for the lesser penalty, which I outlined in a lengthy opinion, was that this was a first offense, no one was harmed, Michael acted under the pressures of unemployment and need, and he seemed truly contrite. He'd never committed a violent act, and he posed no danger to the public. A sentence of close to a year seemed adequate to convince Michael of the seriousness of his crime. Thus wrote Forer. Michael served his time, holding a job all the while, and when his sentence was complete, he was successfully reunited with his family. Oh, did I mention, by the way, that the gun that Michael used was a toy? I probably didn't mention. So the question is, how do judges like Lois Forer develop the judgment to administer sentences that deviate from these sentencing guidelines? And there will be a punchline to the Lois Forer story a little bit later, unfortunately. The third example, just to show this isn't merely about professionals, concerns the work of hospital janitors. A colleague of mine, Amy Wisniewski, who teaches at Yale, has been interested for a long time in studying what sociologists call, quote, dirty work, basically the work of people who are invisible to the rest of us, like, for example, hospital janitors. So she did an extensive study of hospital janitors at a major academic hospital in the Midwest. And in this particular hospital, this is the job description of a janitor. There's going to be an exam. I want you to memorize all those things. There's nothing on this list that should be the least bit surprising to you. There's more. So this is what you do if you're a janitor. The one thing I want you to notice about this list, aside from how long it is that there isn't a single item on the list that even mentions another human being. Which is to say that these people could be just as well be janitors in a mortuary as janitors in a hospital. So, to do the job of hospital janitor is to follow this set of job descriptors. And yet, when Amy studied hospital janitors and interviewed them, though she found that there were some janitors who basically just did the items on the list, there were plenty of janitors who did things that weren't remotely mentioned in the list. There was a janitor named Jake who describes how sometimes he says, I might start waxing the hall and a patient comes out and he wants to walk up and down the hall. He wants to get some exercise. As soon as I get ready to wax, he'll start walking. So I don't bother him. I just wait because I know I shouldn't tell him to go sit down. Patients need to build themselves up, and that's what I have to tell my supervisor. I couldn't do it because of the patients. And then there's Carlotta, who describes how she interacts with people who are visiting sick relatives. She says, I treat them with respect. I know that's, I know why they're here. And like a lot of times when I go into the visitor's lounge to clean, I have to ask them too, is it okay if I clean? Sometimes I don't even bother because a lot of the times when I go in to clean, they'll be asleep. So, but my supervisor has told me that I'm supposed to do this and I'm supposed to do that. But I prefer not to. So sometimes I just have to bite the bullet for that. I try to work with them, the visitors, because I know, some of the things that they're going through with their relative. And then there's Luke, my favorite case. Luke described an incident to Amy. Luke is African American. There was this other guy who snapped at me. I kind of knew the situation about his son. His son had been here for a long time. And from what I hear, his son had gotten into a fight, and he was paralyzed. That's why he got here. And he was in a coma, and he wasn't coming out of the coma. And I heard how he got that way. He had gotten into a fight with a black guy, and the black guy really beat him badly, look, he was here. Well, I guess his father felt a little angry toward blacks. And when I went, and one day I went and I cleaned his room. His father would be here all day, every day. But he smoked cigarettes. So every now and then he'd go out and smoke a cigarette. And he was out smoking a cigarette when I cleaned his son's room. And he came back, and I ran into him in the hall, and he just freaked out, telling me I didn't do it. I didn't clean the room, and all this stuff. And at first I got on the defensive, and I was going to argue with him. But I don't know, something caught me, and I said, I'm sorry, I'll go clean the room. So the interviewer says, and you cleaned it again? And Luke says, yeah, I cleaned it so he could see me clean it. I could understand how he could be. It was like 6 months that his son was here. He'd be a little frustrated, and so I cleaned it again. But I wasn't angry with him. I guess I could understand. So what is it that Dr. Brugman, when he's operating at his best, Judge Forer, when she's operating at her best, and at least some of the janitors that Amy Wisniewski studied, what is it that they have that enables them to make these kinds of choices? Judge Forer and the janitors deviated from the rules, either sentencing guidelines or their job description. They appreciated that rules only take you so far. Many of the most common of our everyday moral decisions cannot be decided by rules, even if the rules are good ones. Let's consider a couple of examples of this. Here's a good rule. Be honest. Is there anyone who does not think that's a good rule? Right? It's like rule number 1 in any set of ethical guidelines for any practice. Be honest. Tell the truth. It is a good rule. But consider this trivial example. A friend of yours is getting dressed to go to a formal affair, a wedding. You stop by to say hello just after she's gotten ready. You knock on the door. She opens the door. She steps out. She does a pirouette. And she says to you, how do I look? And what you actually think is not so good. And the question is, what do you say? Well, if be honest is a good rule, right? So that means what you should say is, not so good. Is that clear? Is that unambiguous? Does it not depend? Does it not depend on your knowledge of whether she's really got an alternative to whatever she's wearing? Does it not depend to some extent on your knowledge of how crushed she will be to find out that her own self-assessment can't be trusted? Because she clearly thinks she looks great, and here's somebody telling her she doesn't. How is she ever going to be able to walk out of her house again, confident that the outside world thinks she looks good, if she's gotten it wrong, so wrong this time? So it may well be that not so good is the right answer, but that's going to depend on your intimate knowledge of this particular person. And sometimes the right answer will be, you look terrific. And so you have to figure out what this particular situation calls for. Whether or not this is a situation where modification of this very good rule, be honest, is appropriate. And I want to point out, you got to figure this out really fast. Because if you wait 5 minutes before you answer her question, how do I look? You don't need to open your mouth. And I think we all know this. You know, when we teach this stuff to our undergraduates who have naive aspirations about what close relations with other people are meant to be like, and who think you can't be a real friend or a romantic partner unless you're completely honest. You know, what we tell them is the thing we know about people who are completely honest is that they get to live their lives alone. So, and this is going to be an important theme of my talk. Experience teaches us that even good rules have exceptions. Without the rules, we might not know how to get started, but all the rules do is get us started. To take a less trivial example, this is more up your alley. This is a real case reported by a doctor named Jerome Lowenstein, who was treating a 70-year-old guy, and he'd been treating him for over a decade. The guy developed a fever and some sort of a respiratory thing, a cough, and he had it for several weeks, and antibiotics didn't do anything, so Lowenstein ordered a CT scan, and the scan revealed masses in the patient's lungs that turned out to be malignant. The condition was not curable. Lowenstein explained all of this to the patient's wife, and she immediately said, "You can't tell him he has cancer." Her husband had experienced bouts of depression throughout his life, and his wife was worried that the word cancer would just do him in. He would basically just roll up into a wall and die. She assured Lowenstein that if he just told the patient that the procedures Lowenstein had in mind were, quote, necessary for further treatment, the guy would comply. Well, Lowenstein, being an ethical physician, agonized. He went home. First he consulted other physicians. What should I do? Then he went home and he did what all males do when they face difficult ethical dilemmas. He asked his wife. He talked to the patient's daughter. He talked to a psychiatrist who had treated the patient for depression some years earlier. After a great deal of anguish, a great deal of soul-searching, and a great deal of hand-wringing, Lowenstein finally decided to honor the patient's wife's request. The patient accepted the diagnosis of, quote, complicated pneumonia, and he lived a decent life for most of the next 18 months. Then he died quietly and comfortably. So be honest is a good rule, but it's a rule that demands that we acknowledge that there are exceptions. And I say, this is obvious to you, or it should be. Another good rule, respect the autonomy of individuals. So, who decides? Is it the patient or the doctor who decides? The answer is, right, the patient is supposed to decide. Patient autonomy and all of that. But what do you do when the patient is about to make what you know unequivocally is the wrong decision? Do you find a way to deprive patients of a little bit of autonomy by nudging them in a direction that is the right direction without acknowledging that you're doing that. That is it okay sometimes to manipulate people into making decisions that are certainly decisions that are in their best interest? Lawyers are supposed to be zealous advocates for their clients. Lawyers are supposed to be counselors for their clients. There's an enormous conflict between zealous advocacy on the one hand and counseling on the other, because zealous advocates simply do whatever they can to get their clients what they want. Counselors will, at least some of the time, focus on trying to convince their clients that what they want isn't what they should want. You see this especially in family law, where incredibly angry divorcing partners want nothing more than to extract a pound of flesh from their soon-to-be ex. And it takes a lot of work sometimes for lawyers to convince clients that vengeance is not going to serve the children better than alternatives. Zealous advocate? Sometimes. Wise counselor? Sometimes. Wise lawyers know which of these two things is called for, which means that sometimes you're willing to compromise this good rule of respecting autonomy. Another good rule, treat people fairly. But what does that mean? Teachers and parents want to be fair. Does it mean that you treat all children alike? Lots of people who don't have children think that what it means to be fair is to treat all children alike. Then you have children, and you discover what a recipe for disaster that is. What it means, really, to be fair, is to treat all children alike in that you give each child what he or she needs. Different children need different things, and that means that different children need to be treated differently. This is acceptable in the family. It's not so clear that it's acceptable in public institutions like schools, where treating different kids differently is interpreted as a sign of favoritism or something like that. So you aspire to formal equality, knowing perfectly well that by treating all kids alike, you are almost certainly missing the mark with most of them. Rules and principles like these, be honest, respect autonomy, and be fair, these are all good rules. But all they are is guidelines. All they do is get us started. They are almost never enough. First of all, there's no rule or principle to tell us which rule or principle is relevant in a particular case. When your friend asks you, how do I look? Is the relevant rule be honest, or is the relevant rule be kind? You can't be both in this situation. And there's no rule to tell you which of these two rules should dominate. Rules are like a roadmap that get you to the right city, but not the right street. You know, I could never get to, what street is this on? Whatever the hell street this is. I could never get to this street if I didn't have a roadmap that got me to this city. But a roadmap that simply got me to the city wouldn't enable me to find the street. So rules get you to the city, something else gets you to the street. What's that something else? It's what Ken and I call wisdom. Rules make the world black and white. Virtually every situation we actually face that really matters is neither black nor white, but gray. Rules are good for black and white situations. Something else is needed for situations that are gray. Rules force us to treat everyone alike, even when different people in different circumstances need different things. And Aristotle appreciated all of this in writing his on ethics. And he took his lesson about moral judgment and moral decisions by watching the trades and craftsmen of his time solving problems that had nothing to do with moral difficulty and moral conflict. So he observed the stonemasons on the Isle of Lesbos fashioning rounded columns. And the question is, how do you measure things out so that a rounded column is perfectly round when all you have is an inflexible straight edge? How do you do the measurement when you've got a ruler that doesn't bend? And what the stonemasons of Lesbos did is they appreciated what the nature of their problem was, and they solved their problem by inventing a tape measure, a soft lead rule that bends. This is an architect's rule. So what Aristotle learned from this is that rules are like this, but sometimes in life we need to bend the rules. Just as the stonemasons know this when it comes to shaping rounded columns, people who are trying to do the right thing with other human beings should know that no matter how good the moral rules may be, sometimes they need to be bent. And what enables us to bend the rules is a kind of moral skill, judgment, moral expertise, which is, that's what enabled Lois Forer to decide not to give Michael a relatively lenient sentence. That's what enabled Jerome Groopman to have this delicate conversation with his patient Maxine. You need this kind of judgment, which you might call moral skill. But Aristotle appreciated moral skill isn't enough. Because if you have this kind of judgment as a lawyer or a doctor, you can use it to manipulate people, not to serve their ends, but to serve your own. Manipulative people are highly skilled at judging what it takes to get other people to act in one way or another. So the skill that the moral skill that judgment entails is not sufficient to get people to do the right thing. What you also need is moral will. You need the desire to serve other people and the skill to figure out what serving other people requires. And the combination of moral skill and moral will is what Aristotle called phronesis, which translates into practical wisdom. And Aristotle has been our guide as we try to make these kinds of arguments about modern life and modern social institutions. So, now we can talk about what practical wisdom is. A wise person knows that no two patients, no two students, or no two clients are alike, and appreciates that rules and standard procedures have to be modified to allow for the diversity of human needs, circumstances, and aspirations. A wise person knows when and how to make the exception to every rule. A wise person knows how to improvise. Real-world problems are ambiguous. They are often ill-defined. The context is always changing. We sometimes think about wisdom as a kind of moral jazz. There are notes on the page. Jazz musicians have to read the notes on the page, but what makes jazz jazz is not that you're playing the notes on the page, it's how you're deviating in interesting and creative ways from the notes on the page. So the improvisation of a jazz musician is the judgment of a wise therapist, doctor, teacher, parent, or friend. Wise people have to know not only when to do the right thing and what the right thing is, but how to do it. As I said before, if it takes you 5 minutes to answer your friend's question about how she looks, you have failed the test. Subtle facial expressions, subtle gestures, careful choice of individual words can make all the difference when a doctor gives a patient bad news. Wise people know how to choose among virtues or among rules when they conflict. As I said, it is good to be kind and it is good to be honest, and sometimes there's no way of avoiding that you have to choose between two really good things. Wise people know how to make that choice. Critical to wisdom is the ability to take the perspective of other people, to empathize. It's very hard to know what to tell your friend unless you can imagine what it's like to be your friend at that moment. And this is very demanding of us. You know, it's not quite, most people think it's good enough to ask yourself this question: what would I want to hear if I were her? That's a useful thing to ask yourself, It's not the right question. It's not the right question. It doesn't really matter what you would want to hear if you were her. What matters is what she wants to hear. And what she wants to hear may not be what you would want to hear. So the golden rule tells us, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What you might call the platinum rule tells us, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And that is very hard indeed. It takes a lot of experience and an intimate knowledge of the other person to get that right. A wise person uses these skills and uses in pursuit of the right aims. And this, again, is critical. If you are really this nuanced and subtle in your appreciation of other people, this is a tool for just shameless manipulation and exploitation. So unless you're interested in what's best for them, you aren't being wise. So the will is just as important as the skill. So this is what wisdom, one last point, I guess. It takes experience to become wise. You can't open up a can and pour it into people's heads. You can't teach a course on wisdom that makes people wise. Having taught a course on wisdom now for half a dozen years, I can attest to the fact that my students finish the course not one bit wiser than they started with. What you can do is teach a course that gets people to appreciate why it is important to be wise, but not how to be wise. That comes from experience. It comes from trying and failing and getting better and better. Groupman learned how to have these conversations with dying patients by having conversations with dying patients and making colossal mistakes and then learning from those mistakes. There's a wonderful book that is, I guess, especially appropriate for people in this room, written by a marriage and family therapist named Blaine Fowlers, who teaches at Florida State University. He trains therapists. The title of the book is Virtue and Psychology, Pursuing Excellence in Ordinary Practices. And his view is that the way to be a good psychotherapist is by becoming a wise psychotherapist, a virtuous psychotherapist. So it's not merely the ethical thing to do, it is the effective thing to do, at least when you're talking about psychotherapy. Okay, so practitioners need wisdom to practice well. And yet, when things go wrong, in schools, in courts, and in clinics, when things go wrong, managers, administrators, and policymakers do not try to make practitioners wiser. Instead, they reach for the tools that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. They reach for rules, they reach for incentives that they hope will ameliorate problems in the short run, but as I will suggest, actually make the problems worse in the long run. The more professionals rely on rules and on incentives, the more the wisdom they need is endangered. Too many rules undermine skill, and too much reliance on incentives undermines will. And I'm going to try to convince you of that now. So I call this the war on wisdom, although no one knows that they're making war on wisdom. Or at least I don't think anyone does. Let's begin with another story. And by the way, the reason I'm doing this by telling you stories is that it's not just that it's hard to present empirical, quantitative studies of wisdom and its absence. It's also that I think wise practice is about what Aristotle called the priority of the particular. And one way to appreciate that is by having the various components of wisdom illustrated in particular stories. So I think the method I'm using to talk to you is the method one needs to use actually to become wiser as a practitioner. So the first story is what I call the lemonade story. Alas, this is a true story. All of these are true stories. A young academic, archaeology professor at the University of Michigan, took his 7-year-old son to a baseball game, Detroit Tiger baseball game. A few innings into the game, his son asked him for lemonade. Dad dutifully got up and went to the concession stand to get his son a lemonade. All they had was a kind of lemonade called Mike's Hard Lemonade. All right, well, so you are more worldly than this kid's father was. Because this dad bought him a bottle of Mike's Hard Lemonade and brought it to his son, who was sitting watching the game. So his son is happily drinking the lemonade, and a security guard sees this and immediately called the police and an ambulance. And the police and the ambulance hurried to the stadium, rushed up to the seats, whisked the child away to the ER of the hospital, where they checked the kid out. You will be relieved to know that the boy was fine. And they were all set to release him into the custody of his dad. That is, the ER docs were, when the police said, "Not so fast." And they took the boy and they put the boy into a foster home. I know, it takes your breath away. They said as they were doing this, "We hate to do it, but we have to follow procedure." A few days later, they went to court, the boy and his dad, and the magistrate said, "We'll let the boy go back home, but only if Dad checks into a hotel." "I hate to do it," said the magistrate, "but I have to follow procedure." After 2 weeks, keeping the boy separated from his incredibly dangerous father, the family was reunited. So this happened, 10 years ago, and about a month ago, I got an email from a woman who, it turns out, is the mom in this little drama. I had not heard from any of them. And she said, it happened exactly as you described it in your book, and we have become, my husband and I have become missionaries about this because we have the wherewithal to fight this kind of craziness in court. But the people who mostly suffer from this kind of ridiculous, obtrusive intervention don't have the resources to fight it. So we're fighting this battle. We have been fighting this battle in an effort to protect people who aren't in a position to fight the battle themselves. So I felt a little better. I actually heard this on a morning edition on Saturday morning. Scott Simon told this story. You guys get that here in the third world? You don't mind it occasionally. I mean, look, I saw those hats. No respectable first world person would wear hats like that, right? They're going to take it away from you at the border, and you're not going to mind one bit. I'm just kidding. I think they're quite lovely. Anyway, so Scott Simon reports this, and when he tells the story, he says, quote, "Procedures may be dumb, but they spare you from thinking. And to be fair," here's the important part, "procedures are often imposed because previous officials have been lax and let a child go back to an abusive household. And we all know how true that is. In Philadelphia, there is at least one story a year, sometimes more than one story a year, of unimaginable abuse of children. And what makes it so horrifying is that these families were already on screen in the child welfare agency. It wasn't like they were unknown to welfare workers. They were known to welfare workers who somehow allowed persistent abuse to occur. So when you see one story like that, your first impulse is to make it so that that can never happen again. And the way you do that is you add another rule and another rule and another rule, and then you insist that the welfare workers follow the rules slavishly, blindly, making no exceptions. You take judgment out of their job so that horrible miscarriages of their jobs are prevented. And this is a case where, it was an absurd, it led to an absurd outcome, but in lots of cases it doesn't lead to absurd outcomes. It saves people's lives. So anyway, this is a case of rules gone wild. Here's another. The Judge 4 case, I promised you that there would be a punchline. The prosecutor in this case was incredibly upset with the judge's sentence of 11 and a half months, and so he appealed the sentence. It took a very long time for the appeal to wend its way through the courts. By the time the appeal had been ruled upon, Michael had served his time and was out of jail, gainfully employed and back with his family. And in the appeal, the prosecutor won, and Michael was sentenced to an additional 4 years and 2 weeks in prison. This had two effects. One, Judge 4 resigned from the bench. This sort of told her that judge had become a misnomer, because the one thing that judges no longer were allowed to do was judge. Judgment had been taken out of the profession, so she resigned. And Michael disappeared, never, as far as I know, to be seen again. So the prosecutor won in his insistence that the rules, in this case sentencing guidelines, be followed. Another example, teaching. Everybody thinks that schools suck in the United States. Almost everybody thinks that schools suck because teachers suck. How can you possibly have good schools if you have bad teachers? So what do you do in the face of bad teachers? Teach them to be better? That would be way too hard. What you do when you have bad teachers is you give them carefully designed scripts to follow, so that even you basically make the curriculum bulletproof. The scripts are designed to be effective pedagogical devices, and any moron can follow a script. And so it doesn't matter whether the teachers are good or bad. And more places in the United States have resorted to this with rigidly scripted curriculum handed to teachers, so that kids are protected from bad teachers or teachers with bad judgment. And so this one example was a kindergarten in Chicago, and this was Christine Javari was the teacher. It was her 53rd day of teaching, and she opened this thick white binder crammed with all kinds of scripts, and she turned to the page that said Day 53. 26,000 Chicago teachers with identical binders, crammed with identical material, opened their identical books to the same page on that day. And what she saw was this: script for Day 53. Title: Reading and Enjoying Literature. Words with B. Text: The Bath. This is a 25-page picture book. Lecture: Assemble students on the rug, or reading area. Give students a warning about the dangers of hot water. Say, quote, listen very quietly as I read the story. Say, quote, think of other pictures that make the same sound as the sound that bath begins with. These are some of the 75 instructions that the teachers have to follow verbatim to teach a 25-page picture book called The Bath. Rules gone wild as a solution to the problem of mediocre teachers. Now, whether that's the right diagnosis of the educational failure is a separate issue. Even if it is the right diagnosis, can anyone imagine that this is the right treatment? One other example, field commanders in Iraq. One second. This is about a lieutenant colonel named Chris Hughes. And he was at a religious center of Najaf on the morning of April 3rd, 2002. The soldiers in his small unit were walking along a street when suddenly hundreds of Iraqis poured out of surrounding buildings, waving fists, shrieking, frantic with rage. They pressed in on the American soldiers, who looked at one another in terror. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, who was wearing these surfer opaque sunglasses, stepped forward, rifle high over his head, barrel pointing to the ground, and he instructed his troops, take a knee. You got 300 people rushing, angry people rushing at you, and your commanding officer says, put your gun down and take a knee. His men looked at him like he was out of his mind. But the thing about the military is that you learn to do what your commanding officer tells you to do. So one after another, swaying in their bulky body armor and gear, they knelt before the angry crowd, pointing their guns to the ground. The onrushing Iraqis fell silent, their anger subsided, and then Hughes ordered his men simply to withdraw. So this little vignette was actually captured live on CNN. And a journalist named Dan Bowers saw it and was struck by it. And he got in touch with Lieutenant Colonel Hughes and asked him who had taught him to tame a crowd like that. And Hughes said no one had prepared him for an angry crowd in an Arab country. Officers learned certain techniques. They learned, for example, to use the rotor wash from a helicopter to drive the crowd away. You know, the wind that the rotary blades create. They learn other techniques. Fire warning shots over the heads of the onrushing, angry residents. Hughes says the problem with that is, if you fire over their heads and it doesn't work, the next thing you have to do is shoot them in the chest. And the Iraqis already felt that the Americans were disrespecting their religious institutions. And so for Hughes, the obvious solution in this situation was a gesture of respect to the onrushing Iraqis. This was not in his training manual. And the question is, how did he and where did he learn it? What made this the obvious solution? Hughes had to read the context. He had to imagine the consequences of any steps he might take. He had to make a decision in a complex, unpredictable, and dangerous situation with competing goals, and he had never been trained for this situation. He had no rules to follow. What makes this an interesting case is that before the Iraq invasion, the United States Army had become concerned that many of its officers lacked the ability for this kind of on-the-ground improvisation. In the year 2000, the Army Chief of Staff wanted to figure out why. What was going wrong with our junior officers so that when they were plunged into unpredictable circumstances, they didn't know what to do. They couldn't use their judgment, or they had terrible judgment. So he commissioned a retired lieutenant colonel to figure out how field commanders had previously learned how to use their judgment in combat, and what it was that they weren't getting now that they hadn't been getting in the past. And so Wong did a detailed analysis of the practices of training field commanders and the practices of training troops. The Army regards wartime experience as the best teacher, as long as you manage to live the first few weeks while you're learning on the job. But Wong found another good learning experience for field commanders, and that is the practice that they get when they are training their units. You are training your units for battle in a non-battle circumstance. And in the course of training your units, figuring out what the shortcomings are of each of the people in your unit and how to get at those shortcomings to improve them, that you develop the flexibility and judgment that will then serve you well in a hostile environment later. That's not why they have field commanders train their units, but that turned out to be, according to Wong, an enormous benefit, an enormous byproduct of the discretion and judgment that field commanders had in training their units. So fine, so why was it not working now? The answer is that in the olden days, field commanders would be given a small number of objectives and then given complete discretion about how to achieve those objectives. What had happened over time is that the Army continued to learn from past generations' mistakes, adding more and more objectives and more explicit ways to achieve each of those objectives, so that by the time Wong was doing this study, a typical training regime, instead of having 5 or 6 big objectives and lots of discretion, would have 297 objectives to be achieved on 256 training days. And what that means is that these field commanders-to-be, as they were training their troops, no longer had any discretion, no longer had any need to use their judgment. They were simply following a script. And now, when they were in the heat of battle, or conflict, if not battle, they had no recourse to the judgment that they had learned as trainers, because they hadn't learned any judgment as trainers, because they didn't need to use any judgment as trainers. The way Wang describes it, the Army has started creating cooks who are quite adept at carrying out a recipe, rather than chefs who can look at the ingredients available to them and create a meal. We need chefs, and we're creating cooks. We all know what the difference is between a chef and a cook. Some of us are, this is a complete digression, but it's funny. My wife grew up in a highly deprived household where there was never a single dish served that you could even imagine eating. Our mother was the worst cook in history. So my wife had no experience with cooking, and even less than no experience with baking. And she was at this social event, and the mother of a friend of ours made this delicious chocolate chip cake. Just delicious. So my wife decided she was going to try to make it herself. So she asked for the recipe, and she got the recipe. And the recipe said, you know, it had butter and flour and sugar and eggs and chocolate chips and baking soda. And the recipe said, combine all the ingredients, put it in a tube pan, bake it for an hour. What the recipe didn't say was, cream the butter first, then add the sugar, and mix it up, then add the egg. Why didn't the recipe say this? Because any idiot who's ever baked knows this. But the trouble is that my wife was an idiot who hadn't ever baked, and so she just threw everything in to the mixer and mixed it up and baked it, and out came, you know what came out. So, you know, if you have no experience, you need a recipe. And you follow the recipe slavishly, and the recipe needs lots and lots of detail, and you become a decent cook, a decent follower of recipes. Chefs are not decent followers of recipes. Chefs are improvisers. They have imagination, they have creativity, and they have judgment. We need teachers who are chefs, we need field commanders who are chefs, we need doctors and lawyers who are chefs, and the cakes will get a lot better. I'll give you one more example of this because it's gotten so much attention. There's a book that you may know about called The Checklist Manifesto. It was written by Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon, also at Harvard. Everybody who writes books and is a doctor seems to be at Harvard. So the point about the Checklist Manifesto is, you know, there are a lot of mistakes made in medical practice, and what you should do to prevent mistakes is give everybody a checklist, a set of rules to follow. You want procedures in the hospital to be sterile so that hospital infections are reduced. Give everyone a checklist. And empower the nurses to tell the doctors, you forgot to do this, you forgot to do that. And his argument, and this has been borne out in practice, is that if you take the checklist seriously, you can cut the incidence of hospital infection to a quarter or less of what it is without checklists. People get busy, they get distracted, they forget to do stuff, and the result is that patients get very sick and sometimes die. So this was his recipe for improving medical practice in general. And I think there are a lot of cases where checklists make sense. But he also had an article that is the absolute antithesis of following a checklist. Consider, here you have a patient, weighs 560 pounds, history of smoking and alcohol abuse, severe congestive heart failure, chronic asthma, uncontrolled diabetes, hypothyroidism, and gout. This is your patient. This patient spends as much time in the hospital as out of it. How do you deal with this patient? You just give this patient a checklist. Let me see. Stop drinking. Stop smoking. Lose 320 pounds. Get regular exercise. You just give him a little mimeographed sheet as he's leaving the office. Do these things and you'll be fine. And now you have done your good doctorly duty. Yes? You think a checklist is ever going to solve this person's problem? So in clinics in inner cities in the United States, there's a fraction of the population that the clinics serve that are responsible for most of the cost of healthcare provision. This is, I guess, a version of the 80-20 rule, except it may be the 90-10 rule. 10% of the patients are 90% of the cost because they have everything wrong with them and they keep going into the hospital, 10 times a year. So how do you fix this? Not by giving them checklists. It's the way you fix it. And this was discovered by Jeffrey Brenner in a clinic in Camden. And what they ended up doing in desperation is they developed a team of a social worker and a nurse and a medical assistant who developed a treatment plan, helped the patient get disability insurance, found the patient a stable home, helped the patient get started in AA, induced the patient to return to church. He described himself as a devout Christian, taught him how to cook his own food. This encouraged him to start taking his medications regularly and to quit smoking. His improvement was slow and noticeable, and his use of the hospital emergency room declined dramatically. In fact, this approach, very personal, hands-on approach, social worker, nurse, medical assistant, saved the particular clinic where this Dr. Brenner worked, saved this clinic 50% on its highest medical utilizers in a space of 1 year. So the point of creating this team is not that you can do checklist medicine, but rather that you need to enter the lives of each particular patient and get to know the patient as a person and the circumstances that the patient lives in, and find a way, enough of a way into that person's life that you can start to make a measurable difference in the patterns of behavior that the person engages in. And why is this important? We have a major problem in the United States with healthcare costs. You don't have it in Canada. The reason that some people in the U.S. think that you don't have it in Canada is because you just let people die and we don't. Some of us know that that isn't actually the explanation. But the question is, how can you reduce healthcare costs? And I think in the developed world, your country, our country, and many others, we have essentially solved the problem of acute disease. Not completely, but largely. And the problem that we face as developed and affluent societies is managing chronic disease. You don't cure heart disease, you don't cure diabetes, you don't cure hypertension, you manage them. Management of disease in almost every case involves the cooperation of the patient. There isn't a magic pill that makes everything fine. Medications obviously help. Patients have to be involved. You have to change the way patients live, or I should say patients have to change the way they live. So effective medical practice in the developed world means effective management of chronic disease, which means partnership between doctors and patients. No checklist will get you patients who become partners. It is hands-on, high-touch, personalized medicine. It is much more expensive to do medicine that way, but the savings on the other end of this high-cost medicine will be an order of magnitude greater than the cost of having clinics that include behavioral health specialists and life coaches and this sort of other stuff. Now, they wrote this article describing these clinics that are doing this and saving a fortune and improving health outcomes, and apparently in completely unaware of how this violated the points that he was making in this best-selling book he'd written, The Checklist Manifesto. This is the anti-checklist manifesto. Checklists are exactly the right thing to use when there are basically no exceptions. There's no excuse for doing surgery with dirty hands. I can't think of any reason to have dirty hands when you cut into somebody's chest. So you can give people a checklist because there are no exceptions. That's not the case when you're dealing with many of the situations, if not most of the situations, that doctors are actually dealing with and treating individuals. So these are all examples of how our excessive reliance on rules ends up underappreciating the importance of judgment and therefore failing to nurture judgment in people who desperately need it. So how about instead of, you accept my argument about how rules don't get us what we need, why don't we turn instead to incentives? Let people use their judgment, but make it worth their while to use their judgment well. We'll just reward people for doing the right thing, and then they'll be more likely to do it. This seems sensible. So let me tell you about a daycare center in Israel. Parents were coming a little bit late to pick up their kids. This was incredibly annoying to the teachers and the director of the daycare center. It was tempting to close up the building and leave these 2-year-olds sitting on a stoop outside, sort of teach their parents a lesson, but they couldn't quite bring themselves to do that. So if parents came late, teachers had to stay late. The director tried to sort of guilt parents into coming on time, and that worked a little, but it didn't work enough. And so, having studied economics, the director came up with a solution to the problem: a fine. If you come more than 15 minutes late to pick up your kid, you will be fined. The fine will be roughly the equivalent of a parking ticket. Now, people already had one reason to come pick up their kids on time, right? It was the right thing to do, and you're just giving them a second reason. Not only is it the right thing to do, but if you don't do it, it'll cost you. So what do you think happened when fines were introduced in this daycare center? Lateness went away? Of course not, because why would I be talking to you about this? Lateness doubled. The paper that reported this result was titled, "A Fine is a Price." The director didn't think a fine was a price. A fine was a punishment. It was an indication you are transgressing, you are behaving badly, and I'm going to slap you on the wrist for behaving badly. The parents interpreted the fine as a price. I have permission to come late. It'll just cost me $15. Worth it. I can finish this call, I can finish this memo, I can clean up my emails, I can do whatever the hell I want to do, and come a little bit late, I'm happy to pay the price. So a fine is not a price, we all know, because there's a kind of moral association to the word fine, but the parents thought a fine was a price, and as I say, it was a price they were more than happy to pay, and the result was that lateness doubled. After several months of this, with lateness creeping up, the director finally figured out that this was never going to work, so he eliminated the fines. Now what do you think happened? Things go back to the way they were? Lateness went up even more. Why? It was a better deal. So I think quite profound point here is that there was some sort of moral hold on parents to do the right thing and respect the teachers and the daycare staff. When you introduced the fine, what you did was completely demoralize this behavior. You eliminated its moral content. It was an exchange of a fee for a service. The fee is this fine, the service is to take care of my kids for an extra 15 minutes. It was no longer a moral act to come on time. And that seemed to alter and the fine seemed to alter parents' assessment of their responsibilities permanently, so that even when the fines were no longer present, they had now recoded this behavior as a fee-service relationship that had nothing to do with asking themselves what the right thing to do was. So the problem is not simply that the incentive didn't succeed in getting parents to come on time. The problem is that the incentive was incompatible with and competed with other reasons parents had to come on time that were almost certainly more powerful than a fine that was the equivalent of a parking ticket. And I don't want you to misunderstand me. If you fined people enough for coming 15 minutes late, the fine would probably work. If, for example, it was a capital offense, a half hour late, we kill you, I'm sure we will come on time. So I'm not saying that you can't ever influence behavior using rewards and punishments. It's just that what seems like reasonable rewards and punishments often won't work, and they will sometimes at least have this paradoxical effect of making things worse than they were before you introduced the fine. Another example. They were trying to decide in Switzerland, this is maybe 15 years ago, where to site nuclear waste dumps. This is a very popular topic for public conversation. When we try to do it in the United States, everybody immediately wants the nuclear waste dump right in their backyard. Right? So there was going to be a national referendum about where these dumps should be located, and the Swiss citizens were quite well informed, and there were people right before the vote who went door to door and asked people, would you be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in your community? So if this survey were done in Canada, what do you expect? What percentage of people do you think would say yes? I'm asking this naively and innocently. 0. That's my sense. In the United States, 0. In fact, they might pull a gun on you in the United States and get you to leave their property. In Switzerland, this is astonishing. 50% of people said yes. Yeah, the people doing the research were a little bit puzzled too, so they probed them. Do you think this is dangerous? Yeah. Do you think it will affect your property value? Yeah. Well, why the hell are you willing to have it? Has to go somewhere. So their answer, not everybody, just 50%, their answer was based on their notion of what their responsibilities were as citizens. They sure as hell didn't want it in their community, but they couldn't think of any reason why their community was any more special than anybody else's community. I'm impressed. You would not get that answer in the United States, and apparently not here either. So they knocked on other doors, and they said, listen, if we paid you 6 weeks' salary a year, would you be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in your community? So you're taking people who already have one reason to say yes, and you're giving them a second. Now what do you think the percentage is of people who are willing? It ain't 50. 90? 85? 25. You cut the number of people who are willing to have a nuclear waste dump in half by offering them a significant amount of compensation for having it. Why? When you offer people money, you essentially are telling them, though you don't intend this, you are telling them, listen, this isn't about your responsibilities as a citizen. This is about what's in your best interest. I am offering you money so that it is in your best interest to have a nuclear waste dump in your community. And now it's up to you to decide whether, in fact, this amount of money does make it in your best interest. And it turns out that when people think about something like this in terms of their own best interest, no amount of money is enough to get them to be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in their communities. Offering them a second reason to do the thing that they were already, at least half of them, inclined to do, undermines the first reason. And that's, I think, in general, what incentives do. They compete with other reasons for doing the right thing, and they rarely compete with them nearly as effectively as the other reasons themselves. Increasingly in American schools, in efforts to improve the quality of education, we have relied on accountability with big tests. Tests big in the sense that they're very consequential. Teachers can lose their jobs, principals can lose their jobs, schools can be closed. A lot rides on these tests. You're not going to let teachers get away with murder anymore. You're going to insist on performance and measure it and hold teachers and their supervisors accountable. This movement in the U.S., known as the No Child Left Behind, well, it was a piece of legislation, No Child Left Behind, has actually resulted in improved test scores. Not everywhere, not across the board, but in lots of places, scores have gone up a lot. This is very good news, don't you think? No, you don't. Why don't you? Why do you think test scores are going up?
Standards are coming down.
Well, there are several reasons. One is standards are going down. Yeah. States get to set their own standards, and when the kids do badly, instead of getting them to do better, you just lower the standards about what counts as a good test score. Second, teachers teach the test. Duh. You know, this is where my bread is buttered. This is what's going to determine whether I succeed or I fail. What the hell else am I going to do? I'm going to make sure these kids know how to psych out tests and memorize the things they need to know to do well on the test. So teachers teach to the test. This is not automatically a bad thing, but chances are pretty good that unless you've got an unbelievably good test, being able to answer the test questions correctly because you have explicitly been taught to answer those kinds of questions correctly says nothing about your ability with respect to the underlying competencies that the test is designed to measure. So those are two reasons, but there's a third reason, which is the most troubling of all. Test scores have gone up because teachers cheat. Not everywhere, just so far everywhere that it's been investigated. They cheat by changing kids' answers. The tests come back and teachers erase incorrect answers and change them to correct answers. There's been this careful statistic. I mean, nobody's actually caught teachers red-handed doing it. So what you do is you collect all these bubble sheets and you do an erasure analysis. And you use statistical models. What's the probability of an answer being changed from right to wrong? What's the probability of an answer being changed from wrong to right? And the conclusion from these analyses is a little bit like DNA. There's like 1 in a 3 billion chance that the pattern of erasures could have occurred by chance. Much, much more likely is that teachers are looking at these things, knowing what the right answers are, and correcting them. So there is a way to incentivize performance and improve outcomes for kids. This obviously has nothing to do with education. Well, it has a little bit to do with education. It's teaching kids the value of cheating. So the final example is bonuses in the financial sector. The way most people who make a fortune these days in finance, which is where most people make a fortune these days, the way they get paid is they get a modest salary, say $1 million, and the real money comes from year-end bonuses or options to buy stock. Now this seems like, a no-brainer, maybe. When this idea occurred to people 30 years ago, it was regarded as a miracle of financial engineering, because you are creating a system of compensation that guaranteed that the people who ran companies cared as much about how well the companies were doing as the shareholders did. Because most of their compensation was tied up in the value of shares in the company. You couldn't get to be the CEO and then start taking 4-hour lunches, drinking one glass of wine after another, because if your company started to fall apart, instead of making $8 million, you'd only make $1 million, and that you can barely, meet your expenses on $1 million. So you created a situation where the better the company did, the better the CEO did. What could be better than that? You now had a system that ran itself, nobody needed to watch it. Right? So how did we have a financial collapse? Exactly, with a system that ran itself and nobody needed to watch it. Well, it turns out there are lots of things you can do that improve the short-term performance of the company and destroy the company over the long term. And what this magical system of smart incentives did was build into the running of companies a kind of short-termist perspective that it turns out to be catastrophic for the long-term interests of the company. So it's just a question of when this falls apart, not whether it will fall apart. And what I found so striking is that when the financial collapse happened, everyone was saying, how can we fix this? How can we fix this? Let's make smart incentives. Not quite realizing that it was a system of smart incentives that had largely created this problem in the first place. And you can't make them smarter, or you can't make them smart enough. What's missing in this case is running companies with the aim, the goal, of the long-term success and health of the company. If you try to incentivize doctors so that they will not do unnecessary procedures, at the moment in the U.S., the more doctors do, the more they get paid. And that's one argument for why healthcare costs are so high. Well, how about if we make it so that doctors get paid a bonus if their per-patient expenditures are below some amount? What do you think is going to happen then? Will doctors stop doing too much? Yeah. What will that be replaced with? Not doing enough. We've already done this experiment in the United States. HMOs, when the first for-profit HMOs began, there was exactly that kind of an incentive scheme. You got a per-patient fee and an allowance for referral to specialists, and if you didn't use that allowance over the course of a year, a percentage of it went back to you. So there was a strong incentive for not overutilizing specialists. Actually, there was a strong incentive for underutilizing specialists, and that's what happened. Why didn't it occur to people that this would happen? People took it for granted that doctors' mission is to serve the interests of patients. So the last thing they would do is not recommend a procedure or a specialist just so that they could pocket some money. And look, it's not unreasonable to have some trust and confidence that doctors' aim is the curing of disease and the easing of suffering. What people don't appreciate is that incentive schemes like this erode that aim. So doctors may start out that way, but over time, they become business people just like everybody else. You can't simply take it for granted that anyone who gets a medical degree will have the aim of easing suffering and curing disease and no other aim. You especially can't take that for granted when doctors begin practice with a $300,000 debt that they have accrued in the course of their medical education. So what we are doing is essentially greasing the skids toward ever-diminished commitment to the real appropriate goals of medical practice. And the same thing is true in the law, the same thing is true in education. The more we rely on incentives, the more we undermine in people the will to do the right thing in their work because it's the right thing. And that's what we actually need, is people who want to do the right thing just because it is. Okay. So, I'm sure you're all completely convinced that what I've said to you is true. The reason I'm sure of that is that you probably already knew it and believed it before I opened my mouth. It's really, really easy to make incredibly powerful arguments to people who already believe these arguments are true. I'm no fool. But the question is, given that rules and incentives are the wrong way to nurture wisdom, what's the right way? And here, I wish I could give you a simple answer, but I can't. First of all, it is critical that we appreciate the importance of wisdom and that we take the trouble to defend it in what we say and in what we do. Encouraging wisdom, encouraging good judgment is not a central aim of any academic or professional institution that I know of. Nobody worries about this. They either hope that the people they're training will get it by accident, or they don't even worry about that. We need to show why it is critical, not an add-on, not something it would be nice to have, but something that it would be essential. It is essential to have if we're going to have doctors, lawyers, therapists, and teachers doing their jobs well. And we need to engage management and administration to help them figure out ways to nurture wisdom instead of undermining it. Scripts for teachers in the Chicago schools are the worst thing you can possibly do if you're trying to create wise teachers. How do you instill in the people you're training both the importance of wisdom the importance of the goals that they are meant to pursue in their professional work, and the opportunity to develop wisdom in the course of being trained. There are a couple of examples of this that I take great heart in because I think they're quite promising. At Harvard Medical School has a pilot program, which unfortunately remains a pilot program, where 12 third-year medical students, instead of doing the usual rotations from place to place, from specialty to specialty, get a panel of patients who they see for an entire year. Whatever the patients come in the door with, these kids treat them. And so what they are learning is that medicine, the practice of medicine is the practice of treating people, and not the practice of treating organ systems, not the practice of treating disease. Now, they do this, they're third-year medical students, they do this with mentors very carefully looking over their shoulders to make sure that they don't kill anybody. But the point is that they have responsibility for managing the health care in all of its complexity of these people for an entire year. And appreciating that healthcare recommendations have to be embedded in the context of the other problems people have in the course of their day-to-day lives. The students are insanely in love with the program. They're totally committed to it. They're committed to one another. They have these group meetings on a regular basis, discussing one another's patients and getting advice about how to talk to this, not how to diagnose the illness. It's not about technical stuff. It's how do I talk to her? How do I reach out to her family? This, that, and the other thing. They're counseling one another. They go along with their fellow students if they think they may be able to be helpful in a difficult conversation and stuff like that. I think this is the way medical education should be in the future. And you're seeing more of it in less systematic ways in medical schools where they actually hire actors to play the role of patients and confront doctors in training with the kinds of real-life complexities that they will have when they face real patients when they're on their own. To teach them how to be a healer of people rather than a healer of defective hearts. And I think that's an indication of an appreciation of the importance of what I'm talking about. The critical thing that I think is underappreciated is that people are teaching you how to behave every minute of every day. They are teaching you how to behave by how they behave. And so when you go on rounds with attendings and they treat the patients as organ systems, that's what you're going to learn. And there's no amount of explicit instruction otherwise that's going to undo the lessons that you learn by observing experienced doctors practicing. So unless we can crack the way medicine is actually practiced by the trainers, we have a significant problem, and these wonderful innovative programs are only going to make a small dent, I think, in the problem. Another hopeful example is legal clinics that are a part of most law schools. So these clinics, instead of taking courses, you actually take cases. People come to the law school with actual legal issues, and the law students, supervised by faculty, take them on. Problems with the landlord, problems with an inappropriate job termination, whatever they may be. Once again, you are counseling, and you are advocating, and you are seeing what it is like to deal with a problem in the context of a person's life that may be filled with other problems. Students love the legal clinic. It's the best part of law school for the overwhelming majority of law students. The problem is that the law faculty regard it as with contempt. These things are almost always taught by adjunct members, not by tenured law faculty, because doesn't have enough intellectual firepower. Law professors are high-powered intellectuals. They don't want to get their hands dirty with the grime of ordinary fights with unreasonable landlords or employers. So they farm this out to lower IQ practicing lawyers, and they pay no attention to it, and they indulge their students because their students are do-gooders who want to actually help somebody. But that's not what law school is about. So it's there, students love it, and what we need is for a few law schools to take it out of the periphery of training and put it right into the center of training and give it the respect that it deserves. and then I think you may see a change in the nature of legal practice. So there's some reason to be hopeful, but it's going to be a long, hard slog, and it won't happen unless people appreciate the importance of the sort of moral dimension of the day-to-day practices of people in all of these professions. And what this means, I think, is that in many ways, courses in ethics, journals about ethics, are the enemy. They're not meant to be the enemy, but what they tend to do is marginalize and ghettoize something that should be a part of the content of every single course and every single journal. I know in business schools there's this obligatory course in business ethics, and the real lesson that the MBAs in training learn is just how insignificant. You know, it's not really a course in ethics in business, it's a course in how to stay out of jail. You know, these are the things you have to do so that you won't get indicted. And, you know, it's nice to know what you need to do not to get indicted. I don't want to trivialize that. I don't want to go to jail. But the implied lesson here is that this is not the serious stuff of one's day-to-day existence in business or in medical practice. And unless we can find a way to make these considerations integral to the content of every course, my worry is that it will never be given the seriousness that it needs. One last point that I want to make concerns my own experience with regard to ethical research. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, I chaired Swarthmore's IRB a couple of years ago. I'd never done that before. I'd never paid much attention to IRBs. For years I did research on animals, and you know, the kinds of issues that IRBs worry about just weren't, never were an issue for me. When I started doing research with people, it was always lab studies. You know, no skin got punctured, no lives were endangered, no deep emotional states were triggered. I mean, nothing could have been more trivial and straightforward. So I would send in these forms, but I gave them like 5 seconds of thought. So now I'm chairing this committee, and I see that, you know, research ethics is a complicated thing. You really do have to worry about protecting the welfare of your participants, and you really do have to worry about what it means to elicit informed consent and all that stuff. And you know, when a sociology student is going to some developing country to interview people about political unrest in the country, is this student putting his or her informants at risk by interviewing them in a cafe? Is it dangerous to be seen talking to an American in a public place? You know, it might be. The student seems to be completely unaware that this is a problem. So it was a big mess. So I deeply appreciated all the effort that had gone into laying out the kinds of things you needed to do to assure that the well-being of your participants was protected, and the safety of your participants was protected. At the same time, I saw that the set of rules that you needed to follow to fill out one of these damn IRB forms was so daunting that it virtually guaranteed that what people would quickly learn to do is honor the letter of the rules and forget completely about the underlying spirit of the rules. Because in the effort to regulate, we had created so many challenges that just getting past the IRB form was enough, and people would stop thinking about are my participants really at risk? Is there really anything dangerous that the rules don't cover?